It used to make a difference who you voted for. In the 1983 general election, Margaret Thatcher and Michael Foot offered very different visions for the country. In the United States presidential election, Ronald Reagan and Jimmy Carter similarly had very different ideas in 1980. It made a difference who you voted for. Now, some things were not up for dispute. The Overton window wasn't wide in those days, but it was more than the arrow slit we seem to have today. Previously, if you controlled TV and the print media, you could have a very strong say on who won and lost. In the US, for example, CNN effectively installed Bill Clinton by ignoring his many and obvious flaws. By the time Hillary had a crack, the internet was a thing, and the truth could not be so easily suppressed. Now, it's important to remember that democracy is not a natural state of affairs for the human condition. For almost all of our history, we were part of tribes, big or small, which were essentially run by the alphas. As society developed, these institutions were formalized into rudimentary legal codes. The barons and major landowners pretty much did as they pleased, and everybody else simply obeyed or died. The nation-state arose as larger barons declared themselves king, and kings fought each other for territory that we now call countries. You can see this in the historical narrative of the day. You'll scarcely find a Tudor chronicler that has anything positive to say about the Plantagenets. But about 100 years ago, something strange happened. In order to fight industrial-scale wars, it was necessary to press gang, more or less, the entire military population, or male population of military age, into armies. Hitherto, a Napoleonic army may have been large, but a World War I army saw conscription on a scale not previously seen. The end of the war saw formerly entrenched dominant political structures either fall away completely or face execution, as was the case with the Romanovs. And even in the UK, one of the notional winners of World War I, there was great concern in the corridors of power. They realised that simply releasing 4 million trained killers back into society and saying, well, thanks lads, now it's business as usual, wasn't really an option. The scale and carnage of the First War changed all that. In the First Boer War, the British Army lost barely 400 troops. In World War I, it was closer to 1 million. So lo and behold, fearing the fate of the Kaiser, Tsar Nicholas, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and others, the Representation of the People Act was passed. This was not a sudden notion that an enlightened and just way to run a country was a representative democracy. It was nothing more than a realization that concessions had to be made. Make no mistake, this was the elite protecting itself and nothing more. They were scared, and they had good reason to be. The more historically aware among them knew about Wat Tyler's exploits in the Peasants' Revolt, and they knew the fate of Charles I, and they'd seen what had happened recently in Europe. So fairly quickly after World War I, we became a democracy in the sense that we know today. Incidentally, feminists, it wasn't the suffragettes and Millicent Fawcett who got you the vote. It was the men who died in the trenches. In the 1920s, radio was still a fairly new thing, and newspapers were the dominant force in the media. If you controlled the national press, you controlled the narrative. The free speech thing was all very well if the plebs had no effective way to speak to the mass of the people. In the 1930s, we saw the adoption of television in Europe, and by the end of World War II, this became entrenched. It's no coincidence that a national broadcaster was established and licenses were required for anyone else who wanted to start a TV or radio station. So again, if you controlled the TV or were on good terms with the media barons, the democracy thing wasn't a major concern. If, on the other hand, you were deemed to be a threat to the status quo, the whole arsenal of the mainstream media was turned against you. This was a lesson that Tony Blair and his acolytes learned. They knew they had to kiss the ring of the mass media magnates. They did what they were told and got positive press. Just let that sink in for a moment. By contrast, Blair's predecessor, Neil Kinnock, failed to learn the lesson and was roasted. Commentary at the time suggested that the Murdoch-owned Sun's criticism of Kinnock may have been a significant deciding factor in who won the election. Also, politics was then, as it is now, about money. If you backed a political party, you could be fairly certain of legislative favours when that party won an election. It's been estimated the best investment you can possibly make as a corporation is political lobbying. The return on capital vastly exceeds any other area of investment by multiples. How else do you think former politicians become so rich? Do you think Hillary Clinton or Theresa May are particularly amazing speakers? Would you pay hundreds of thousands of pounds to listen to either of them? Do you think Tony Blair invented the iPhone? Blair's net worth is around £80 million. Where do you think that came from? Some of the corporations, however, realised that being partisan was not the best possible strategy. Why take a risk on backing the loser when you could back every horse in the race and be certain to have your voices heard in the corridors of power? And thus we arrive at modern politics. There were two great shocks which shook the establishment to its core. The election of Trump, which was wholly against the dominant media narrative. Celebrities and the media were ranged against him, and yet nonetheless Trump won. Similarly, pretty much the entire weight of the media was deployed against Brexit. Nonetheless, the UK voted to leave the EU. In France, Emmanuel Macron was more or less invented by the media when the mainstream socialist and conservative parties had become discredited. There was great concern Marine Le Pen could be elected. But populism was on the rise, and it seems relentless, so we're seeing more and more extra parliamentary ways to resist it. The political persecution of Donald Trump would disgrace a banana republic. In the UK, fringe political figures are arrested, debanked, and generally harassed by the establishment in ways which were unimaginable in the UK only 30 years ago. The recent winner of the Dutch elections, Geert Wilders, was banned from the UK by then Home Secretary Theresa May, and rampant two-tier policing disgraces a formerly politically neutral police service. So what can we do? First, we have to absolutely disavow ourselves of the notion that it makes any difference whether it's Rishi Sunak or Keir Starmer as Prime Minister. They're both fundamentally social democrats pursuing an ideology that ran aground 30 years ago and is sinking us. Similarly, the Liberal and Green parties are even more committed to the destructive Green policy, for example, which will see us poorer and shivering in the dark. If there's one thing that's clear now, it's that we need real change. Not cosmetic change that sees different personnel do the same jobs, but real, meaningful change. The sort of change that will be resisted tooth and nail by the establishment and the media. There's a tendency to think that just because Labour and the Conservatives dominate politics at the moment, they always have done and always will. But this is not true. 120 years ago, the Labour Party was nowhere near power. Office used to revolve between the Liberals and the Conservatives, but that paradigm ended quickly, and so can the current one. In 1906, the Liberal Party formed a government with 397 seats in the House of Commons, but by 1922 it was over for them. In 1945, that party barely existed. In 1900, the Labour Party had 2 seats in the House of Commons. By 1929, they'd won most of the seats. Things can change, and these days they can change very quickly, but only if we make it happen.